The Chicago White Sox officially announced Pedro Grifol as their new manager. Grifol said all the right things during the press conference, and his overall message was a breath of fresh air. Grifol has an impressive resume. However, he brings zero MLB managerial experience to the White Sox. Can he sell his philosophy to the players? And will they be interested in buying in?
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Sox fans, welcome to Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen each and every day. We're free and available on all platforms. Follow us on Twitter at Locked On Sox. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just search Locked On White Sox. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Hey, I'm your host, Nick Morawski, a lifelong diehard Chicago White Sox fan, recording this podcast just blocks from the ballpark in beautiful Bridgeport. You can find me on Twitter at Nick_GGTV. Really appreciate you letting me steal some of your time to talk off-season White Sox. Locked On White Sox is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Rick Hahn was all kinds of excited to introduce Pedro Grifol as the new White Sox manager. Grifol had a refreshing message and definitely used all the right buzzwords. The easy part is over. The White Sox have a new manager. Now comes the real work. The White Sox made it official on Thursday. They announced Pedro Grifol as the 42nd manager in franchise history. Sox put the information out. It felt like it was around 9 a.m. on Thursday on social media, and then blasted an email out as well. The press conference was at 11 o'clock. It wasn't terribly long. It was on NBC Sports Chicago. They had it live until there was some bizarre audio issues, and they had a cutaway that interrupted some things. And Chuck Garfien and Ryan McGuffey were in the studio to chop it up. Len Casper was the master of ceremonies, so to speak, at the press conference. No sign of Kenny Williams or Jerry Reinsdorf. However, they might have been in the back away from the camera. It was Pedro Grifol and Rick Hahn at the table. Both took questions, and Rick Hahn had some blanket statements before things got going regarding Grifol in the hiring process. We found out that Pedro Grifol wears number 5 because of George Brett, but he obviously couldn't wear number 5 when he was working for the Royals. He wore a variety of different numbers while with Kansas City. Hahn, this was interesting. Rick Hahn did thank Juan Uribe and Josh Harrison for allowing Pedro to have the number 5. Read into it what you will. Does this mean that Josh Harrison will not be back in 2023? Who knows? Maybe too early to tell, but it was worth noting, I guess. Grifol is the first outside the organization hire since Gene Lamont back in 1992. Unbelievable. 30 years the White Sox have been going inside the organization. This will be Pedro Grifol's first MLB managerial gig. Grifol, he said all the right things on Thursday morning. Quote, raising the energy level every single day is very important. We are going to work hard and we are going to be prepared to play, end quote. Grifol also said, quote, we've got to improve defensively, obviously, and I feel fundamentally we need to improve. This is a very good club. It's a club that's prepared to win. I'm going to be a stickler to the preparation, the energy. It's going to get us where we want to go, end quote. That was very refreshing to hear. I'll tell you that. Here's more of what Pedro Grifol said about what to expect in 2023 from the Chicago White Sox. We will communicate. We will be fundamentally sound. We will play with passion and pride. We will be prepared to control the strike zone. We will definitely hold each other accountable. That was really great to hear, and it was refreshing in many respects. That stuff, though, should have been done already, and it just goes to show you how many steps backwards the White Sox took in the last 2 years. The bar has been dropped so low, and simply playing sound baseball is not enough right now. It's almost like the foundation has to be rebuilt, and everyone is hoping Grifol and the coaching staff can get the most out of this talented White Sox team. I say we as a fan base have been starving for a different leadership and a different culture. Pedro Grifol checks those boxes, but he still has to sell his way of doing things to the players. That could be a tough task. Now, the players did not hustle, play the game right, communicate, while a 3-time World Series championship manager was in charge that apparently was loved and respected. So why should we believe that players will run through a wall for a first-time manager? I'm extremely hopeful and want to be optimistic that he will get White Sox players to buy into his philosophy. Have players accepted the fact that they were completely embarrassed this past season? Does it really matter to them? Or as long as the money is deposited, it's all good? It sounds like Grifol wants to get his house in order and set the tone on day one of spring training. That's a welcome message. I couldn't tell you who was more excited, Pedro Grifol or Rick Hahn. I'm going to tell you how Grifol became the right choice for the White Sox. More on that in a moment. BetOnline.net is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Here was Rick Hahn's statement on Thursday. Quote, Pedro is bilingual, a modern baseball thinker who brings 2+ decades of experience in a variety of roles. He is an excellent communicator and an experienced game planner who brings high energy and detail-oriented approach to leadership. He is committed to building an exclusive and cohesive clubhouse, and we could not be happier to have Pedro leading our club, end quote. Hahn was gushing. If you had a chance to watch this press conference, wow, you know what I'm talking about. Rick Hahn said the initial candidate list was 22 to 24 names. It swelled to 30 at one point. 8 candidates got interviews from 7 different clubs. Grifol was the second candidate interviewed and seemed to impress right away. It sounds like the White Sox knew what they had with Pedro early October. Hahn was definitely all kinds of excited to welcome Pedro Grifol to the White Sox. Definitely a much different Rick Hahn than 2 years ago. Hahn was asked about the differences people can expect to see from the White Sox under Grifol's leadership, given he's from outside the organization. Hahn talked about game planning and preparing the players offensively, said it will be a lot different than in the past. This is Hahn again. Quote, in Pedro, we are hiring someone who is a renowned communicator and a modern baseball mind. It was very clear to Rick Hahn, Kenny Williams, and Jerry Reinsdorf that he would be the unanimous choice. end quote. Reports are out there saying that Joe McEwing and Frank Menachino will be replaced. Katz and Hasler will return, and former Toronto Blue Jays manager Charlie Montoyo will be the bench coach for the White Sox. Hahn confirmed that during the press conference on Thursday. The Montoyo hire was a collaborative effort, apparently, as will the hiring of other coaches to Grifol's staff. Hahn did not comment specifically on any other names like McEwing, Daryl Boston, or Frank Menachino. However, those reports are out there that they should be gone. Hahn on the Grifol hire, quote, "You may be seeing me smile a little bit more than you have over the past year and gushing a little bit more than I have in the past year. And that's because it's a little difficult for me to contain the excitement that many of us feel," end quote. Was that some sort of maybe dig at Tony La Russa or the folks that forced Tony La Russa down our throats? In a way, it felt like it. It really did. Hahn just could not contain his excitement. Definitely clear from the press conference that this was a guy Rick Hahn pushed for and probably the type of manager he wanted 2 years ago. It was one press conference, but a lot was discussed and a new direction was started. I'm going to tell you my initial thoughts on the Pedro Grifol hiring. More on that in a moment. So just some initial thoughts after that press conference, hearing what Pedro had to say, what Rick Hahn had to say, the questions that they were asked and answered. Pedro Grifol, look, he said all the right things. You know, he clearly knows where the White Sox have lacked because he saw them with his own eyes while in Kansas City. He and Rick Hahn seem to be in lockstep in regards to the direction that the White Sox need to head. These conversations were probably being had the last few weeks, and Rick Hahn even alluded to discussions have been going on. Again, I think they knew Pedro Grifol was their guy a while ago, early October. Grifol knows the AL Central. He's got a proven track record of getting the best out of players, specifically a guy like Salvi Perez that White Sox fans are well aware of. Grifol embraces analytics, but also welcomes the old school approach. Grifol has talked about how, pennants aren't necessarily won in April and May, but they could be lost. Meaning, I think, he puts such a priority on playing the game the right way the entire season. He does not have an ego. Said that if he's the smartest person in the room, then there's a problem. I like that he is open to new ideas, and I hope he surrounds himself with guys that will challenge him instead of just being obedient. Pedro Grifol had a good message and hit all of the White Sox shortcomings, but now he's got to get White Sox players to believe into that. And that could be difficult to do. You've got some veterans on this team, and here Pedro Grifol is coming from an organization that honestly, look, hasn't had a lot of success at all. Okay, they went to the World Series, Kansas City Royals in 2014. They won in 2015, had a couple 100-loss seasons the last 3-4 years. I wouldn't necessarily say that that has been a successful organization. And again, this is Pedro Grifol's first MLB managerial position. So there might be some players that just might not be interested in listening to what he has to say. So how are you going to sell this team on that philosophy, get everybody to play together? Because again, I loved what Pedro Grifol had to say, but they don't really have to, he doesn't have to sell me necessarily. It's these players. I'm still bothered that in this critical time frame for the Chicago White Sox, we are going with a first-time manager to take the Sox to the next level and beyond. But look, I liked what I heard, and I feel like the White Sox are serious about change, which is a great thing. It sounds like there's going to be some more information to come as this coaching staff starts taking shape. And then shortly after the World Series, hopefully we'll get, some player developments, namely Jose Abreu. Folks, thank you so much for making this podcast part of your daily routine. You can find the Locked On White Sox podcast absolutely everywhere you find your podcasts. We are on Twitter at Locked On Sox. You can find me on Twitter at Nick_GGTB. Thank you so much for making Locked On White Sox your first listen. For your next listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast. The biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up on the next episode, I'll continue to examine off-season White Sox scenarios as the White Sox go full steam ahead with the Pedro Grifol era. Really appreciate you making time for the Locked On White Sox podcast. I'm Nick Morawski, and until next time, go Sox.